What's going on, guys? For those of you who subscribe to my channel, welcome back. If this is your first time here, please hit the subscribe button if you find any of this information useful at all by the end of the video. Also, if you don't want to miss my future videos, go ahead and ring the bell to get notified every time I post new content. Before we get started, I want to know what you guys need help with. I can make videos about a million different techniques, go over a million different things, but this channel is all about you guys and what you guys want to learn. Also, I've thought about maybe recording some of my sessions to show how I set my lighting, interact with and pose my clients, and basically just my overall session. So let me know down in the comments what you guys think. In today's video, I'm going to go over removing unwanted clutter in our images and also completely replacing the background to get different looks in the same setting. Unfortunately, we don't always get a huge amount of space to shoot in, and even if we do, we may need the lights to be super close to our subjects to get the ideal lighting. This causes the stands and other items to have to be in the shot. One way to avoid this is to take a plate shot first, but we will cover that in another video. Since this video may be long as it is due to the amount of things that we need to cover, I've already done the majority of the editing up to this point. Basically, all of my camera raw adjustments, frequency separation, some dodge and burn, liquify, and a few other things are already done. I don't want to overwhelm you guys with too much, so we're just going to focus mainly on the topic of this video. So let's get started. Okay, so this is the image that we're going to work with here. Couple notable things here. We want to kind of figure out what we want to do with it before we start doing anything. As I said before, this is already pretty much pre-edited. I did all of the stuff that I needed to do prior to making my selections and stuff like that. So all the skin smoothing and all that is done. So the first thing we're going to do is we know we want to make a selection of the background and get rid of the background. Notice there's a lot of little small details here that we need to get rid of. This bottom part here, the ground part, we're actually going to keep that and we're going to use that in our final image. But if we are going to use this, we also have to take out this light stand here, take out this softbox here, and then just generally clean it up. And since this is going to be a little bit of a darker image, I already know the background that I want to use for it, and we'll see that here in a second. Since it's going to be a darker image, I'm not really worried too much about these areas in here. Let me zoom in here. I'm not really worried about this transition here. I'm going to darken that down anyways, so it's not going to be really in the final image. Now, I already pretty much made a selection and everything, but we're going to go ahead and go through that process. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to hit Control Command J to duplicate my background. And then I'm going to take my quick selection tool here. And you can use the pen tool if you want, if you're more comfortable with that. You will get a better selection that way. But with all these little fine details, it's going to be kind of hard for me to use a pen tool, and it would literally take me probably hours to do this selection. So this is just a little bit easier way to do it. So in order to get our main selection, I find it easier to select the background first. You can do it the other way. You can select the subject, but I tend to find this a little bit easier. If you go over some parts, don't worry about it. We're going to go in and fine-tune this selection here in a second. Okay, so I got the main background selected. So if you hold the Alt or Option key, you can actually take away from the selection. So notice here her head is also selected. I don't want that selected, so I'm just using the bracket keys to make my selection tool here bigger or smaller. And then I'll hold the Alt Option button and I'll just click and drag. And just make it smaller and just grab that area. You want to kind of you want to try and stay inside as much as possible. If you go outside of these edges, it'll be a lot harder to refine that edge later once we get into select and mask, and you'll see what I'm talking about once we get into that. So we'll make this selection here. We're just going to grab all these parts here, just going back and forth using my Alt button or my Option button to deselect, and just a regular click to select. And I'll probably fast forward some of this so you guys don't have to sit here and watch me as I create these selections, because this is probably going to be the part that takes you the longest. But I do want to do some of it here just so I can kind of show you the process of how I go kind of back and forth and get this selection ready. So every time I select something or deselect something, the algorithm gets a little bit better and it starts to understand exactly what you're trying to select and what you're not trying to select. So just have patience. Again, go back and forth, selecting and deselecting, and then you'll eventually get to where you want. Now, one thing to notice here is this lace part here. This is going to be a pretty advanced cutout here. Since it's kind of transparent, but there's a lot of little intricate pieces that we need to cut out. We're actually going to do that on a separate layer, and you'll actually see how much easier it is with this method that I'm going to show you. Alright, and then all these little spots in here, you want to try and get as much as you can. We're going to go back in with select and mask, and we're going to get some of the finer details. And again, I'm just going back and forth, just trying to grab a selection. And the better your first initial selection is, the better off you're going to be, the easier it's going to be to refine that selection. So with this part, you're going to want to kind of take your time and just make sure you're getting everything that you need selected. And since I'm using the ground, I'm not going to select any of the ground. The only part that I'm probably going to fix is going to be this part here. So you'll notice some of my sandbag is actually in the shot underneath the tire. So that could be kind of a tough area to fix here, but we're gonna try it anyways. Okay. So again, I'm not gonna really select this whole thing because I already have a selection made, and you'll see that once we get to this next step. Okay, so we got that much selected there. So the next thing to do is, while you're still in your selection tool, remember we selected the background, so you're going to see marching ants around the top and the sides. So what you're going to want to do is hit Control-Shift-I or Shift-Command-I if you're on a Mac. And then notice what that does is it takes my selection and just inverts it. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and create a mask. And then once that's selected, once that mask is on there, we can go into Select and Mask, and we can refine our mask here. So we have three tools that we have a couple different tools up here. This first one we're not really going to use. That's just another quick selection tool. And then we have our refine edge brush that I was talking about, and then we have our regular brush tool. So if I go in, first thing I'm going to do is grab my regular brush tool, and I see that there's some stuff over here that wasn't selected. So I'm going to actually subtract from the selection and just brush that out. And I can actually go in and change the hardness of my brush because I want to kind of match the hardness here, and then just kind of go around this area. Since this is kind of hard to see where the edge is, I'm just kind of making my own line, and it's not really going to be that noticeable anyways. And then you can flip back to the plus, and then you can go back in and refine how you want that line to go. And I can actually make my brush even a little bit harder. And you're just going to have to kind of play with the hardness of your brush to kind of figure out where it needs to be for your selections. And then again, just kind of going back and forth. Okay, so we got that selection. So what I would do next is I would zoom out a little bit here. Go into my refine edge brush and generally just go around the hair. And notice how that actually cuts out these little pieces here and gives me a good edge. But notice it did leave some of that background in there, so I can go back into my brush tool and subtract from the selection and just brush over those areas. And you have different view options too. It's on layers right now, but a lot of times I'll use overlay so I can see exactly where it's going. Or if I know what my background is going to be, like in this case I know it's going to be a little bit darker background, I'll go on black. Or if I know it's going to be a bright background, then I'll go on white. And that'll kind of give you an idea of how it's going to look on the actual layers. You can even do on layers and then throw your background behind it. But that's I'm not going to do that this time. Then again, just kind of go over the hair with a small refine edge brush, and it'll kind of cut those little pieces out there. And then anywhere like on the bike or wherever, if you have like jagged lines, you can kind of go over those areas. I see there's a little bit of white seeping through on her arms here, so I can kind of do the same thing here. Just go around and use that refine edge tool, and that fixes it for the most part. And right around here. And then another thing I like to do that might be a little bit helpful is if you go over here, you see you have all these different options here. Let me just refine the rest of her hair and I'll show you another little trick here. So I take this out here a little bit. And you can actually take this feather slider, and this will kind of feather your selection. And see how it's making it a lot smoother, but it's also pushing the edge out. So we want to shift that edge back in as much as we can here without losing too much detail. And then we want to take this contrast slider and sharpen that edge back up a little bit. So that'll just help you create a lot smoother lines. And then remember this area down here, I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger. This area down here, there's really no way to fix that in this particular mode here.
I didn't catch that.
So now I'm going to go ahead and output to new layer with layer mask, so I'm non-destructive. And that way I can actually go back in and fix that mask later if I need to. So then what I can do is I can duplicate that layer, and in order to tackle this one, let me turn this top layer off here. I'm actually going to use Blend If. So Blend If is a very, very, very powerful selection tool. So if I double click on the right hand side of the layer, you're going to get these blending options. And what I'm noticing here on this layer, there's this layer and underlying layer. We're not worried about the underlying layer because we have nothing underneath it. So we're going to go on this layer, and what do I want to keep? I want to keep all this black part, right? And I want to get rid of this like lighter gray. So if I want to get rid of the lighter parts, I take the right hand side where the white is, and I start pulling that back, and I'm not worried about anything in here other than that particular area. So I'll pull that back until I don't see any more gray, and then I can hit Alt or Option and click here and it'll split that. See how these are split now? So now if I pull these off and pull these over and feather it, I can kind of go back and forth and kind of just, you know, refine exactly how I want this to look. And it's okay if I have a little bit of this gray showing through, because with this being kind of like a sheer, I don't even know what to call it, but with this being kind of like a mesh, you're going to have some of that in there anyways. In order to make it look realistic, you're going to leave some of that in there. So I think that actually looks good. So I'll go ahead and hit OK. And then I'm going to turn this top layer back on. And then I'll go to the mask on the top layer. And I'm going to hide that mask in this area. So if I go hit B for my brush tool, start brushing this area out, see how it pulls that out of there. And that's why I was only looking at this area, because now I can go over this whole area and get all that out of there. Now notice it did pull some of the leg out, so if I go over, I do need to be careful in that area, but in these black areas I don't really have to be too careful. So I'm going to go back and paint with white since I screwed this up here, and I'm going to paint her leg back in. Okay. So that kind of gives you an idea of how I actually cut all that out. And again, like I said, I already have this cut out on. I did that previously, so I have a better selection. So I'm going to show you that now. So let me go ahead and turn these off, and then I'll turn this on, and you can kind of see my selection here. It's basically the same thing. And then this is going to be my background that I wanted to use, so I just basically threw that in there. And the next thing we need to worry about is, remember we have this area here that we need to fix. So basically all I need to do is, first I need to take this light stand out. So now I'm just basically making a new layer, throwing that up at the top here. And I'm just gonna alt click over where I want to sample from, making sure my opacity is at 100%, flows at about 1%, sampling all layers. And then I'm just gonna start brushing over the areas that I want to replace. And you can use a higher flow if you want. I just like using a lower flow because it gives me more control. But this just kind of gives you an idea. And then I keep sampling in different areas and just kind of go over a little bit at a time. And just sample again over here. Maybe I'll bring my flow up to maybe about 6%, somewhere around there. And just make sure you go over all the areas that you want to fix. And it could get a little tricky by the leg here. Okay. And just kind of go back and forth. And the more time you take, the better your selection is going to be. Now, keep in mind, people aren't going to be zooming in to like 800% to look and see what you did, so most of this is not even going to be noticeable. But take your time, go through it, make your selections. Okay, so now we got rid of that. So the next thing we need to get rid of is going to be this big softbox down here at the bottom. So for that, I'm going to use the shortcut Shift Option Command E, Shift Control Alt E if you're on a PC, and that creates a stamp visible of everything that we just did. So basically it takes all the layers below it and puts it all on a new layer. And with that, what I can do is I can go into, let's see, let's make a selection here. So I'm just going to use my polygonal lasso tool. Click once here, click here, all the way down, and I'm just basically going over what I want to get rid of. And then once you make that selection, you can go ahead and hit Edit, Content Aware Fill, and let Photoshop do its thing. And it may not be perfect every time, and you may have to refine, some of those, some of these edges and stuff like that. But for the most part, it works really well. So I'm actually just going to output this to current layer. If you want to be non-destructive, you can output it to a new layer. I'll just hit OK here, and then I'll hit Command D to deselect. And it actually did a pretty good job. And I'm going to darken pretty much all this down anyway, so it doesn't really need to be perfect. Okay, so now that that's done, the only other thing, actually, let's turn that off real quick. And the only other thing that I want to do is I'm going to create a layer below my model layer because I forgot to fix this area down here. So we're going to go to our clone stamp tool again. Make sure that this layer is below your model layer, because if not, you're going to end up going over the tire here. So got that layer there, so I'm going to use my clone stamp again. Alt click where I want to sample from, and then I'm just going to start painting in here. Okay, and notice it didn't go over any of the wheel or anything like that because that's what I had selected. Another thing you can do is, I don't think this is very realistic having all of the sky in focus. Now I was at like F8, but even at F8 you're not going to have all of that sky in focus. So what I'll do is I will I made a copy of it so that way it's non-destructive, and I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I'm going to blur that background there, and I'm going to go maybe like let's go 9%, somewhere around there, 8.5, 9%. Okay. So that looks a little bit better. It separates them a little bit more from the background. And then when I turn this on, now I know I'm going to have to mask this out, so Command I. So what I'm going to do is I took that stamp visible and I just created a black layer mask, and I'm going to go in with my brush tool, and then with 100% opacity and flow, I'm just going to brush over that area there. The next thing we're going to do to kind of tie these together is I'm going to create a curves adjustment layer, and I'm just going to pull down on the bottom here just to darken it a little bit, and then pull up here, and then hit Command I to invert it. And I'm actually just going to, with about 20% opacity, 15–20%, I'm just going to kind of brush with white around the bottom here, just to kind of darken it down. And I kind of want this area down here to be a little bit lighter still, kind of like there's maybe like a little spotlight or something like that. And maybe add a little bit of contrast here and there. So I'm just like doing like one click, like in certain areas, just to kind of add contrast where I want to add it. Okay, so there we have that. And so here's a really cool color grading trick that I use quite often. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate my background layer because the colors don't quite tie in with the foreground. So my foreground and background doesn't quite tie in very well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I'm just going to blur the heck out of this background. All I want is the color. I don't want any of the texture or anything like that. I just want the color. So now that I have that here at about 179, I'm going to hit OK, and then I'm going to change this blend mode. You'll see as I go through these different blend modes, there's different things we can do here. I think what I want to do is I'm going to bring it down to let's go soft light. So I'm going to go soft light and then bring the opacity way down, and then I'm just going to slowly bring it up just to add some drama and add a little bit of color to kind of tie these two together. So maybe about 25%, somewhere around there. And then, of course, wouldn't be one of my images without my selective color and my color pop. So if you watch my previous tutorial on making your image pop, I actually give this this preset away, so you guys can go ahead and grab that. So hit that color pop, and that's basically just going to add more color. And then you can lower the opacity to whatever looks good to you, maybe around 50%, and then I'll hit Command J to duplicate, Command I to change it to a black mask, and then just paint with white. I'm just going to kind of go over certain areas that I feel like I want more color. So maybe in the background here, in the sky, let's add a little bit more there. I think that looks good there. Okay. And then we can go into our color balance and we can add another color grade on top of this. And I think what I want to do is you have your shadows, midtones, and highlights. So I'll go through each one of these. And so the highlights, I want a little bit of like orange in the highlights. So maybe add a little bit of red and a little bit of yellow. And we'll see what that looks like. Okay. And then maybe even balance it out with, now we'll leave the green and magenta alone. Midtones, I'm going to basically do the same thing. +2, -3. See how that looks. Okay, so that's adding a little bit more color. Go into our shadows, and I'm actually going to do the opposite in the shadows. I'm going to actually bring some cyan, maybe -3, and then bring some blue into the shadows. So very, very slight color grade, but it adds a little bit of contrast, adds a little bit of the drama. So what the only thing with this is adding all those kind of darkened everything down. So I may want to go in and do like a curves adjustment layer, pull that up a little bit here, and then hit Control or Command I and just kind of brush in wherever I want more light to be. So I want to brighten up this part here. And maybe even go back in here, pull up even more. Okay. So I think that looks good there. And maybe brush out down here. Then maybe add, notice I'm only on like 16% flow, and I'm just kind of adding light in whatever areas I want to kind of emphasize or bring back. So maybe even right here on the bike, you can actually just kind of dodge certain areas, like maybe her arm, maybe do like a click or two on the face, just to kind of bring that up just a little bit. I notice it's a little bit dark here. I still want to be able to see some of the detail, so I'll go ahead and dodge some of that, and then maybe even dodge a little bit here, dodge some of the leg. Same thing over here. Oh, maybe too much, so undo. Lower my flow here. Just add a little bit of brightness in these areas. Okay. Just a little bit there, a little bit there. Maybe down the arms. And I think that looks pretty good. All right. So there we have it. So I'll show you real quick here. Let's go back down here and we'll do before and after. So there's before and after. So a couple things we learned here is how to cut out the background, how to cut out some like intricate areas in here, and which I can, let me zoom in and show you real quick here. Like that is awesome. Like you can still tell that, you know, there's material, really fine material in between even these black parts here. So that's actually a really good way to cut things out. And all right, that's it. So if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, share this video with anybody who you think may be able to learn from it, and let me know in the comments what you guys think. And if there's anything else you want me to cover, let me know. Alright, see you guys next time.